Hello and welcome to the Overly Animated Podcast, where we take animation seriously. We provide fan-oriented and analytic discussions on a variety of animated shows, movies, and anime, including Steven Universe, Gravity Falls, Star Wars Rebels, Moonbeam City, and RWBY. I'm Dylan Hysen, and today I'll be taking you solo through the latest episode of Star Wars Rebels, Relics of the Old Republic, Season 2, Episode 2. We are doing Star Wars Rebels coverage every Wednesday night when it airs. I'm not on video this week, so just the audio version of this podcast, although we post that on YouTube as well, and you can find all of these links at overlyanimated.com. One thing about the podcast I wanted to mention is I've introduced show-specific iTunes feeds, so if you just want to subscribe to our Star Wars Rebels podcasts, or another show, or multiple shows, but not the main feed, you can find those links on overlyanimated.com on the right side, a little bit down. And so I mean, I'd prefer if you subscribe to the main feed, but if you know you're only interested in this show or a different show, then I think that's a good way to reliably get our content without, receiving 3 or 4 podcasts a week, which is what we do. Yeah, let's get into this, probably a short podcast because it's just me today, so I don't know, I'm not expecting more than 15 minutes or so, but let's see. I'm going to get into Relics of the Old Republic, the latest episode of Star Wars Rebels, a continuation of last week's first part of the series. Of the season. And so this episode, I like this episode. The show seems to be incapable of producing a bad episode. I kind of talked about that last week. It's probably the show's biggest strength, is that it has a very consistent, very consistently above average floor. In terms of critical quality for the show. So by floor, I mean the worst episodes of the show is the floor. And I think that floor is still an above average episode of television, even if it's only slightly so. I'm not going to say that this is one of the best shows on TV. It's still pretty early in its run, and I don't think it is. But I still do very much like it, and there's several times throughout the first season when I think it achieved a very high critical quality of television. I don't think this episode was one of the stronger ones. I think I said last week's episode was one of the weaker installments of the show. I don't know if this week was better or worse. I kind of wish that they were not divided into 2 separate weeks, because this episode is very much a continuation of last week's. A lot of times when shows do 2-parters, they're really just 2 separate entries. Of course, they're going to have continuing connecting elements or story-wise, but the big question is whether they thematically are the same. And this episode, to me, was thematically the same as last week's. We kind of hit on a lot of the same themes. One of the big character points being Kanan's apparent pre-conviction against not liking clones and that prejudice. And I talked about last week how I really love this addition to Kanan's character. And it continues here. It's a major part of this episode. One of the biggest payoffs is seeing Kanan deciding to come back and save the clones and Rex. And it was it was kind of as emotional as the show gets, I guess, because it's a big moment for Kanan's character and for the very strong element that was set up last week. I really loved this edition last week because Kanan's, one of the most important characters in the show, and he didn't have many flaws before this. Not that, he's kind of a great person, so he doesn't need to have obvious flaws, but just seeing these more human elements to Kanan really makes him a very strong character, and I do think he is one of the strongest characters on the show now, in large part due to this recent addition. So this connecting episode, I really do feel like it's just a similar thing as last week, because it thematically connects, really. We also have Ezra's connections with the clones and everything involving that, which is another big element of the show. So in terms of grading this critical quality wise, it's hard to differentiate it from last week is my opinion. I think overall these 2 episodes make a fairly solid episode of the show. I think it's probably still below average, but it wasn't bad. Like I said, the show's never bad, and even this I still feel like is above maybe one of the worst 2 episodes of season 1. So let me start, I guess, by getting into I already talked about one of my biggest positives from this episode, which is the Kanan clone prejudice. Not a surprise. I praised it last week. I'll praise it again this week. I think it was very well handled here. I think in retrospect, it's an even stronger plot element because we had the payoff here. I kind of just liked it as an element of his character last week, and here it pays off in terms of the plot of the show. So I very much enjoyed that. I think this episode was very action heavy, and the show doesn't, in general, I'm someone who is not always instantly engaged by straight up action sequences. This show a lot of times succeeds more than other shows in terms of engaging me, especially in Jedi battles. I find those very interesting. This was obviously not one of them, but I feel like this kind of transcended the typical action scene from the show because it had the element of the pretty interesting element of using the Force to find these new walkers, quote unquote new to the show. I'll get to that in a minute. Within the storm, and I think that was a great decision, a great idea for a plot point. It kind of rounds the action sequences within plot. I'm always a big fan of having narrative intertwined within your action sequences. Of course, there's always some narrative, but it's usually just a beginning and ending objective, and the action sequence is about getting to the end. Here we have genuine character growth for both Ezra and Kanan, and it relates to their trusting of the clones, and it's also about the continued growth of Ezra as a Jedi and Kanan training Ezra. I think it's just very well handled. And it's kind of surprisingly well handled. This is kind of a high concept narrative device for the show to be using. Not the show's incapable of it, but typically the show is kind of treads pretty safe ground narratively. It's not doing too. It's pretty tropey, quote unquote tropey. When I mean that, I mean kind of typical narrative devices, which isn't a bad thing. It's typical things are usually good, and the show plays it safe. That's a good way of phrasing it. The show plays it safe a lot, and I feel like this is kind of taking a risk. You could just have a straight up action sequence and it could be, it's never going to be bad. It's Star Wars. We expect these type of action sequences with walkers, with vessels, with Jedi fights. These are things that are going to be expected on the show. But here, I feel like we're kind of taking a risk by tying our narrative into the action sequence. And I think it succeeds, and the episode benefits a lot from it. The episode doesn't lose me with like last week. So I do think this is a stronger episode than last week now that I think about it. Last week kind of lost me with its fishing sequence. That was not very strong. And here we don't have an equivalent of that. So I was pretty impressed by that. So I mentioned before, the other kind of the big thing with this episode, I guess, in terms of Star Wars mythology, I think, now asterisk, I'm not the most knowledgeable about Star Wars mythology, which again isn't to say I don't love the surrounding everything involving the show. It's just I'm not someone who's like constantly into the show as some other people are. So I'm pretty sure that what this episode is doing is introducing the four-legged AT-AT walker. I did have to look up the name again to remind myself, and I'm also unsure of the pronunciation. I looked online, and then there's a lot of debate over whether it's AT-AT or AT-AT. So I'm going to say AT-AT, but I'm aware that it's ambiguous, I think. And this is not something that again, I'm pretty sure that we've seen before in Rebels. We've seen the two-legged walkers a lot, and after doing some research, I believe that in Clone Wars there is a six-legged version of this. I'm not sure if I remember seeing that in this show, but this represents I think, evolution in the Star Wars universe to the four-legged AT-AT walker, which we eventually see in the original trilogy. Of course, the show takes place between the prequels and the original trilogy, so seeing advances like this are pretty interesting in terms of just how the show functions within our two already established kind of trilogies properties. I'm sure this would be an even bigger thing for a super fan of Star Wars, but even for me, kind of more of a casual fan, it still is very interesting to see. And, if I put like 5 seconds in to look up what's going on here, although I kind of already could tell, like I knew from the preview last week, I was like, whoa, we haven't seen those four-legged walkers before. If you put in, after like looking very basically at the basics of what's happening, it's pretty interesting to see this evolution. I think that's the type of interesting thing that the show can do. It's kind of limited by where it stands within the Star Wars universe timeline. I read an interview on EW. I referenced this last week too, Entertainment Weekly, with co-exec producer Dave Filoni, who I think that's his title. I don't know. Who was talking about how really there's in the initial title, the initial crawl for episode 4, it says the rebels achieved their first major victory, and that's kind of what happens right when episode 4 begins. So they're so limited by what they can do with this rebellion now, because this is about the formation of the rebellion that we eventually see in the original trilogy, and and they can't win a major battle ever, so that's never gonna happen, right? So I guess that's a reason to focus on Ezra and gang primarily, because it's not like the larger force is ever going to do anything major. I assume at some point we'll see a major defeat. Maybe that comes towards the end of the show, or maybe multiple major defeats. But I do like using that as a frame to still focus on our main gang, who's really the emotional core of the show, and we really shouldn't strive too far beyond our main gang here. I feel like introducing Ahsoka's already pushing it a little bit, and I'm interested to see, because she's back at the end here, if she's still a part. If she's still a part of the major crew, and that's an interesting question in the answer. They kind of shelved her off for these 2 episodes, and she's back now at the end. She kind of had to be back there for the payoff with the clones. That was another thing that I'll get to in a second, but first let me finish talking about Ahsoka, who's back now at the end, and she's gone, and now she's back, and I'm skeptical of her being part of the main crew for a significant portion of the season, but we'll see what happens. This is a whole new world here. There's a larger rebellion compared to season 1, I mean. There's this new commander. Now we have Rex back here. Is he going to be a major part of things? So there's a lot to manage, and I prefer that the show stay within its season 1 core. I feel like the Siege of Lothal movie, while maybe one of the most interesting ones to the general, to people who watch, I feel like there's 2 types of people who watch the show. There's people who watch the show who are Star Wars fans, and then there's people who watch the show who are Star Wars Rebels fans. And I'm not saying those won't overlap, but if you watch the show and you're like, oh, it's Rebels, it's okay, I love Star Wars in general, though this is probably one of the worst properties for Star Wars, which is, is probably true. Star Wars is a very high quality property. And this show, while good, is not necessarily incredible yet. So I'm not saying that's not fair, but if you are someone who does that, I feel like the Siege of Lothal movie was probably the most interesting to you, because we got to see Vader, and it was super important within the overall Star Wars timeline and mythology. However, the Star Wars Rebel fan is what I would say I fall under, which I think is the person who you want to host a podcast on the show. You want a fan of the actual show itself. I find it more interesting to focus on Ezra and our main crew, the crew of the Ghost. I feel like that's what I'm attached to in the show. Star Wars Rebels is that main crew. There's really nothing... because the surrounding mythology is part of a larger mythology, we don't see... It's hard to get attached to that. It's not like that's the show's own. You can get attached to Lothal, which is why I thought that was a great choice. I've talked about this too many times. A great choice to focus season 1 on Lothal. You can get attached to specific elements, but the overall mythology is not like yours as a fan of the show. So the only thing that kind of is the characters. So focusing on them, I feel like, is really vital to kind of have the show, to use a cliche, stay within itself. I just think it's a very, very important thing that the show is going to have to manage as it takes on a larger role within the Star Wars mythology. So I don't know if anyone wants to write in, let me know if you agree with that. I feel pretty firm about that. But I could say, I'm not saying you're wrong if you you like Siege of Lothal more than anything that's happening here. Certainly that was more exciting than these first 2 episodes. However, I would prefer if Siege of Lothal is like a once a year type thing. We have an entire season, then we have a special movie that's kind of more general Star Warsy, and we bring Vader back there. Then that's fine. But I don't need Vader being the main villain of the season. It's not that I don't need him. I just think it's a mistake because it's a distraction from the core of this show. So I think it's a good idea to introduce 2 new Inquisitors, which I'll talk about. So the other thing, which I think I mentioned 2 minutes ago and put off, is the whole element of this episode involving the backstory with Rex and everything there from the Clone Wars. Now, I have not seen the Clone Wars show. So that kind of disqualifies me from talking about this. So, but I think that this episode does a decent job of kind of laying giving enough information and laying the framework so that the emotional beats can still pay off for non-Clone Wars viewers and even people who watch Clone Wars who just haven't, seen it for a while because the show hasn't been on for a little bit. I think it does a decent job of managing the past mythology. It's like, not only is this show dealing with, all of the movies, it had a previous animated show that it's kind of trying to pay off here too, with Ahsoka and Rex, and that's a lot to manage. I'm worried that they're going to get lost within it, as I said before. But stuff involving Rex and the clones, I love that they tie it to Kanan. That's the main thing. We see the previous Clone Wars through our kind of main character lens in Kanan. Not that Kanan's the main character. He's kind of, I guess, the secondary main character of the show. But seeing it through someone who we can emotionally connect to is a great focal point for the viewer of this show, and having them emotionally care about all the Clone Wars stuff that we're bringing up. So I think that's really good. And seeing it pay off at the end with Ahsoka in terms of Kanan, in terms of all of them earning Ahsoka's trust, I guess, in terms of them making her happy. But it's like, it's not because of that. It's because Kanan couldn't abandon these people, even if he had a prejudice against them. And it's also the element of they tie to his past too. Maybe not them directly, but these type of people. And I think it works here. I think the show was a little too if anything, the last episode was the exposition-y one involving this stuff, and was the one that maybe tied too heavily to Clone Wars, and this, I think, does handle it very well. Let's talk. I haven't even talked about a lot of elements of the show yet. Let's talk for a second about the new Inquisitor introduced at the end, who's apparently named Fifth Brother, voiced by Philip Anthony Rodriguez. I'm not super familiar with him, but he sounded very menacing and interesting at the end of this. I was a huge fan of Jason Isaacs' Inquisitor in the first season. Great decision, I think, to have him. His battles with Kanan were some of the best parts of season 1, and he was extremely menacing, unlike Agent Callus. Ooh, I didn't talk about that. So introducing Fifth Brother here is interesting, and also how he's like, I don't care what Agent Callus does. He's like Admiral Constantine at the end is like, we kind of screwed over Callus. He might be dead here, and Fifth Brother comes in and is like, I don't care. It's pretty interesting, and it kind of raises the stakes a little bit, so I like that decision. I care not for your struggles. I will succeed where you and Callus have failed. Kind of very general line of dialogue from the show, but that tends to happen. The show is surprising in how it can pull off these kind of cliche lines, I think. I kind of buy into it in a way I didn't think I would before I started the series. Not that I think they're great, but I'm fine with them. It's interesting. I just didn't think I would react that way before I started the show. Let me talk about Agent Callus for a second. I don't think I talked about this yet. My reaction to kind of the first season of the show, when we met Agent Callus, was like, wow, this guy is not interesting. He is instantly kind of made incompetent by the initial Rebel gang in like the first movie and of the show before episode 1, and he's just instantly, we know he's not that big of a threat, and he's not that interesting a villain. We don't really know anything about him. I like how we kind of intersperse him throughout season 1, but he's never the main threat. The Inquisitor steps into that role, and even before that, we have the council member, woman who's also even bigger threats than him. He's just not a very interesting villain. He's kind of the bumbling villain. So I think it's a mistake to have him be the main opposition force in this episode. It's handled okay. It's not handled badly because he's not the threat. It's the new AT-AT. That's the threat. So I like how that is we know the writers know that Agent Callus is not a menacing threat. So we have to bring in a new type of vessel, vehicle, whatever. It's to have any challenge at all to our people, to our established heroes who constantly just defeat the Empire, right? That's kind of the thing with the show. That's another thing that's not a threat is stormtroopers. Stormtroopers are kind of almost comical tactical in the show, in how often they do not hit with their guns, and how often they are easily defeated by our rebels. So I think it's a little bit of a mistake to bring Callus back here. They handle it fine given that they bring him back. Like, I think nothing they do is bad, and I think it's a actively good decision to bring in the new technology to mask his presence. Like, you need no new technology with Jason Isaacs Inquisitor. He's just instantly a presence, instantly super menacing. With Callus, you have to have additions. So I just question the initial decision to bring Callus as the threat for this episode. Now, if you're going to do it at all, you have to do it here, because we have to escalate from here. We kind of have the tease at the end of this episode for the new Inquisitor, and we work our way up from there. We're gonna bring in Sarah Michelle Gellar as the seventh sister, which is gonna be super interesting. I'm excited for that. And but these two episodes come off of Vader as our main villain. You can't get better than Vader, and we go to Agent Callus. Oh man, that's not a good shift. So I don't. Maybe the correct decision is to instantly bring in Fifth Brother. I know that's a lot of episodes where you have to have the two Inquisitors sustain being kind of the villainous force, but you're kind of leaving these two initial episodes out to dry. And even though you have a lot of great elements to it, these can't ascend to the levels of some of the best of season one, or get even close without this great opposition force. And Agent Callus is certainly not that. So I think these two episodes do get a little screwed by the planning of the season. It's like you have to have an escalation in the opposing force. So it starts off small, and then we get bigger, and this is the small, and as a result, the small can't ascend to the heights that we want it to. I think it probably would have been a good idea to read these episodes both at once to get past them. But at the same time, I'm fine with letting this season last as long as possible. I can see this season seeming very quick. We have a limited number of episodes. I'm not actually sure how many episodes. Not sure if that has been or determined yet. I would assume the same as the first season. Nope, 20 this season. Okay, interesting. So that is a lot. So I would have, I think maybe we should have aired these two at the same time. Anyway, other things here that we have not discussed. I love them freaking out over the four legs. I talked about that, yeah. They call them giant death machines. They eventually say walkers, which I think is a fine word for them within the canon. It's, could refer to them as walkers. And, it's their presence in the show. Honestly, they do not seem super threatening. So this is a possible potential problem. Kind of halfway through the episode, Ezra decapitates one of the AT-ATs, and it's like, okay, instantly they're not that big threats. I mean, they had to retreat into a storm to avoid them, but it's like with some careful Jediing, we can easily defeat them. So I feel like they're only a threat for their introduction, and then it's like, they kind of solve the problem once they come back for Rex, in the same way that they have with the TIE fighters and the regular two-legged walkers. With they take over the vessel. They've done the same thing. Zeb drops in, he's like, hi, and he smashes their heads together, and then he takes over the vessel. We've done this at least twice before, guys. It's the same thing. And then you fight the other ones with the one that you have commandeered. So that's the formula. This is the typical. We can call this the Zeb. That's called the maneuver. This is the Zeb now. It's the maneuver. They're not that threatening, honestly. I never felt super worried for our heroes in this episode, I guess, is my general point. What else we got? We had a little... I always want our... I think I'm going to start the segment, our shipping watch of the week for... There's only one possible relationship in the show, Sabine and Ezra. What I wrote down, Sabine balancing Ezra here. I guess when he was trying to get onto the gun and stuff. Brief note on that. I've kind of loved how they've handled this potential Sabine and Ezra thing, because when Sabine got introduced, or once we saw her more than 2 seconds, I was worried that she would just be this her character would be taken over by being Ezra's love interest, Ezra the main character, and it has definitely not happened that way. If anything, we've gone for more of a slow burn type thing, but I kind of love how they've handled in that it's just like awkward teenage flirting between the two, mostly from Ezra's side, and it's kind of made it's made this plot element much more sympathetic than it could have been if it's like thrusted into the spotlight. Side note, I was worried about it consuming Sabine's character, but we also don't have really that too much of a character for Sabine. That's something I'd like to see built up in this season, is Sabine and especially Hera too, doing more things. Kind of we know a general backstory for Sabine, but we have not seen that much. We know only generalities from one episode of season 1. What else do I have on my show notes that I took for this episode? We actually saw Hera more than 2 seconds here. She's talking to Chopper. Chopper was we can have your is Chopper tolerable watch every week. I get very annoyed by Chopper. Chopper was tolerable this episode, so there you go. He was fine. What we got here? We had the whole element of the storm. I talked about how I like them and using the Jedi things. I have Agent Callus responding to one of his soldiers. No, you are losing them. We're losing them in the storm. No, you are losing them by slowing down. Full speed ahead. And I had LOL Callus written down. Like, okay, Callus, you're super menacing, sure. They just decapitate them very easily. Everything with Admiral Constantine, that was weird. That he's a name. I don't know if he'd had a name before, and that he's I guess this is this new Inquisitor instantly just discarding Callus's life is like a typical way to gain. He doesn't care. He's scary, you know. He doesn't even care for his own subordinates. So I guess that's a pretty typical way to go about that. Yeah, I think that I probably covered everything here. Excuse me. Yeah, so there you go. Relics of the Old Republic. Overall, decent episode. Not great, but better than last week. So I've determined, as I've talked about it, I've determined it's better than last week. Very much looking forward to next week. I think I had a description up here somewhere. I saw half of the preview before the recording cut off, but let's see. Always two there are. So a nice Yoda title there. While searching for supplies on the fleet, Ezra, Sabine, Zeb, and Chopper are going on a daring mission to an abandoned metastation, but when 2 Inquisitors sent by Darth Vader are endangering Sabine and Ezra, Zeb and Chopper have to find a way to save them. So we get both Inquisitors next week. That's exciting. Very interested to see Sarah Michelle Gellar as the other Inquisitor. And potentially a Zeb and Chopper focused episode. Interesting. Zeb, I feel like, is one of our more established characters, but only from the first half of season 1. After that, he was kind of shoved to the background. So I'm fine with him coming into the spotlight a little bit here again, because it's been a while. That being said, I feel like Zeb has a really good, well-established character and a nice emotional attachment from the audience to him. Zeb and Chopper probably are 2 most annoying characters, so let's see how that works out. Although Ezra's pretty annoying too. Okay, there you go. We'll cover that next week, October 28th. And I'm Dylan Hysen. You can find out everything about this podcast at overlyanimated.com, and you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/overlyanimated. Thank you to our current patrons, Shayna, Mitch, Cordell, Beatrice, Nate, Andy, and Jamie, aka Hannah, Fever, Mitch, Cordell, University, Beach Exchange, Buzz Like Your Mailman. We really need your support, and you can do that on patreon.com/overlyanimated. Other notes about overlyanimated.com. I've kind of been revamping the website in the past week. I've added a blogs section, so you can check out my recent posts about general animation topics there. And I mentioned our show-specific iTunes feed. Find our Tumblr and Twitter links and follow us there for more updates and updates on the blog posts. Upcoming podcasts. Tomorrow I will be discussing Moonbeam City with Delaney. And then big thing is Ruby is back, RWBY, on for those who are not familiar is how it's spelled, on Saturday. And we'll be hopefully covering Ruby regularly every week. I'm very excited to do that. I'm rewatching, going through Volume 1 of Ruby right now. I'm going to hopefully rewatch both of them before Saturday. I'm very excited. Big fan of Ruby. And yeah, so those are our upcoming podcasts. I'll be back potentially with Mel for a 2-person podcast this week. But once again, I've talked for 30 minutes straight. So I don't know how I did that. But I did have to stop for like pauses, drinking water pauses. A lot more talking than normally. Usually I just throw it to a co-host and listen. But yeah, let me know what you thought of this, of our Star Wars Rebels coverage, and we'll see you next time. So thanks for listening, guys. Bye.